Alrighty. Welcome to the next lecture for my U.S. History 2 course. This particular lecture is going to be over the American Industrial Revolution, Part 1. Kind of just introducing what is the Industrial Revolution in America. So for my students who are watching this is the second unit in our study of U.S. History 2, which, as you know, goes from westward expansion through to the Great Depression. So we've got a ways to go. Anyways, America, as we understand it and see it nowadays, comes out of the Industrial Revolution. Although there's important things in previous eras about capitalism, individuality, independence, work, and culture, industrialization is really what we see as being a big changer for America. The America that we kind of start seeing with familiarities like mass culture, the expansion of the working and middle classes, and consumer capitalism really come to the forefront in the Industrial Revolution. Although L.P. Hartley once said, the past is like a foreign country, they do things differently there, this past industrializing America is perhaps more familiar than any previous iteration or version of the United States that y'all have seen up to this point. Now, for my U.S. History 2 course, one of the things that we are looking at is the Industrial Revolution after the Civil War. Basically, this is the second Industrial Revolution, and we'll start seeing America take the steps to become a global power through industry. Now, in this unit, this is the first one on the Industrial Revolution in my classes. In our textbook, what this amounts to is 9.1, Innovation Boosts Growth, 9.4, The New Immigrants, 9.5, A Nation of Cities, and 9.6, New Ways of Life. That's where we are in the textbook. Laconically put, we'll be looking at industrialization and what it meant for the worker, immigration, culture, society, and cities. Think about these changes through industry and how they impact the American experience. Anyways, let's start with our learning objectives. Understand how and why the United States chose to industrialize. The second objective is the technological and capitalistic setup of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And the third thing that we're going to be looking at is the effects and effects of the Industrial Revolution. Because I use both effect and effect because there's an emotional impact that impacts the way people wrote and acted in this period, as well as an effect such as what people were doing, how they lived, and how America's landscape really changed. So, as we move through this lecture, we will be building off of these three ideas. My students would probably benefit from taking notes over such. Anyways, we've got some key terms here. As I stated before, I recommend that the turkeys, what I refer to as students in my class sometimes, take a moment to go through, record, and look up each of these terms. They can be found in the glossary. And also I've created a Quizlet that students can access to understand these terms. Since it's just a long list of terms, and a lot of people don't really do well with memorizing long lists, I recommend kind of reorganizing the list after you've looked up the definitions into the concepts of economics, culture, and immigration. These three big ideas are kind of where all these terms fall in together. But anyways, take a moment for that now. Pause the video if need be, well, probably, and we'll get started on the next phase. Alrighty, ready? Let's go. Anyways, you can see there's quite a few terms, don't worry. They kind of fall together as we go throughout. Now, pre-industrial America is radically different from post-industrial America. To kind of really understand that, we kind of have to look at the before and after. Pre-industrial America was a rural America. Farm-based society, perhaps closer fitting to Thomas Jefferson's yeoman farmers, where you have that kind of self-sustaining, can-do farming attitude. Um, this America's only cities were those commercial ports like New York, Boston, etc. Those were in the north. In the south, the only port or population of any concentration was in New Orleans, once again, port city. This pre-industrial America was closely connected to farmers. Small towns served as local hubs, dotting the seemingly infinite patches of farmland. The tallest building in most of these towns was typically a church bell's tower. Government policy also drew kind of inspiration out of this agrarian dream. The Homestead Act is actually a prime example of this mentality. Effectively, it believed that a man and his family just needed a plot of land to carve out a living. Though America documents the state of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, perhaps Locke's original document listing property instead of happiness fits as well. Americans kind of saw themselves as a farming nation. But no, so these statistics really hammer it home. 70% of Americans lived in rural areas of the U.S. 30% were in those East Coast towns. The South's primary industries were cotton and tobacco. The Homestead Act, in case you don't recall, it's 160 acres, which is considered an ideal amount of farmland in the eastern United States. If there was any manufacturing, it got shipped elsewhere. But now, not all Americans sought this rural vision. In the Northeast, those port cities sought to imitate the first industrialized nation, England, which you'd hear more about in world history. Some thought, why ship our raw materials like cotton or timber abroad when manufacturing could be done in our own country for profit? Because, pre-industrial America depended very heavily on Europe for manufactured goods, Britain and France especially. Britain for many manufactured goods, and France had a fairly thriving textile industry as well. However, Europe has a problem. They often had numerous wars that we wanted to avoid. There's a reason why a lot of people came to America from Europe, and that was to avoid conflict. And do recall in this time period, Britain and France were not too terribly fond of each other. And Americans really didn't want to be caught in the middle of this kind of conflict. And so in those northeastern cities, with founding fathers like Hamilton, there was a desire to, change from this rural society dependent on European manufacturing. The Civil War is what changes the game. In the Civil War, or the war between the states, the North showed that the industrial-powered nations have more money to spend, more resources to make, and more opportunities to win wars. The Union Army in the war between the states basically outproduced the South in almost every regard. Guns, uniforms, railroads, etc. Private industries gained tremendous power and profits up north, like Vanderbilt is a good example, and his railroad and naval empire, started off with shipping, went into railroads. We'll talk about him later in the class. But these kind of things will kind of shape post-war America. And when the United States was reunited under with the conclusion of the Civil War, essentially the South was devastated, and the North, in the fighting, had increased its industrialization. And so the Civil War kind of really established the idea that the United States is going to be an industrial nation and continue down that trend. Now, we need to talk about the process of industrialization. There's certain things that industrialization seems to require. There are 4 rather common traits that have been observed in industrial revolutions from England to Japan and whatnot. And those things are large urban populations, resources, a transport system, and consumers. We'll break it down by each of them. First off is the large urban population. Somebody's got to run those machines. You need workers in the working class to work in the factories, or if we use the French term, the proletariat. You can probably thank Marx for dragging some French into your U.S. history classes, because you need people to make things. That's the key point to industrialization is manufacturing, making things in large quantities. Now, number two, resources. Factories are, if you want to think of it in this analogy, they're hungry things. Steel and stone for their bodies, coal to power them, plus whatever raw materials you need to crank out that finished good. To feed these places, you just have to look at places like England. England took over much of the world and set up an empire where the sun never set to get manufacturing raw materials for their manufacturing. Likewise, when we look at Japan's industrialization in world history, Japan carved out portions of Korea and China to industrialize itself. The United States, we had it a bit different. We didn't have to go out as far as some countries. Westward expansion is what drove moving west. Manifest destiny, we often talk about it in classes as kind of this idealistic drive. There's also pragmatic purpose to it. Whereas the United States went west and sought places like California, it was just the similar methods and ideals and plans that England had when expanding into places like India, raw materials. And so America's westward expansion, you can see that California produces gold and crops. Colorado produces lots of raw materials mined out of the earth. Wyoming for coal, iron, etc. The third thing you need is infrastructure. Goods and raw materials need to be moved in and out of factories as cheaply and quickly as possible. Manufacturing goods is essentially a much faster way of producing goods, but there's no point in producing goods more quickly if you can't move them out and you can't keep that well-oiled machine going. It just shows how pervasive the language is that we use Industrial Revolution terms to explain the Industrial Revolution. To keep the machine going, you need to keep it fueled. But railroads, canals, seaports, these are essential things to move goods, whether they're raw materials or finished goods, around. Now, the last thing you need are consumers, the people who buy all that stuff out of the factories. We will talk more about them later. And one thing that's worth noting is they don't necessarily have to be local, but especially in the earlier industrial revolutions like Britain and the United States, really they started with local manufacturing. But some of those consumers can be foreign. In fact, once your local markets get exhausted, you have the local consumers buying up as much as possible. You'll start looking into other countries. China is a prime example of this, often considered the world's factory nowadays. Anyways, those are the four things that industrialization requires. Large urban population, somebody to work, resources, stuff to work with, transport, a way to move stuff, and consumers, somebody to buy stuff. So this industrial revolution is partially why the United States expands into all these territories out here for the resources. Now let's talk about some of the technology that comes up during the Industrial Revolution. The second one particularly. There are some very important innovations that really make the difference. In class, we'll be looking at communication, but there's some other things that are worth talking about as well, like steel, coal, and later oil as well will drive industry and growth. But to start with steel, steel was used in skyscrapers. By refining iron and making it stronger, we could, removing the impurities, we could make stronger things like skyscrapers and suspension bridges. One thing that's worth noting, the Bessemer process is the procedure used to make steel stronger. That is one of your key terms, so keep that in mind. The reason why skyscrapers and suspension bridges are important is when you look at a skyscraper like this, you can now fit a lot more on a very small land piece. So that means cities don't have to spread out as much. They can go up first. Because one of the big things you have to keep in mind before really a lot of modern transport systems is people, for the most part, are going to be walking to work. And so they need to live as close to their workplace as possible. If you think back to the medieval ages, that sometimes meant right above the shop. But so skyscrapers are important in that capacity. Suspension bridges are also noted because they can carry a lot more goods over bridges. And so this is one of the important technologies that's used to connect bays, go over rivers, and basically create shortcuts for railroads and later on cars and trucks. But here's some more pictures of different bridges and skyscrapers. You can easily see that this holds a lot more than this little building over here. And space-wise, it's just more efficient because it goes up. Thankfully, elevators were also invented very close to the time that skyscrapers were developed. So there's a lucky innovation in that. Anyways, communication is another important thing. One of the great limitations that human history has had is the ability to send messages and communicate long distances. If you ever sit through my ancient civ classes, you know that one of the biggest challenges that early empires had is everything had to be sent by, well, the fastest way to communicate was by horse. Like to go from here to here in the U.S., that's a long ways. Likewise, communication is very important, whether you're trying to organize an empire or organize a business. There's a lot going on in this chart. You can pause it and read it on your own time. But essentially, the big thing about communication, big developments, whether it's the telegraph, the radio, or the telephone, these technologies make communication cheaper, more likely to succeed, and faster. The reason why cheaper is instead of having to pay for horsemen to ride across, if you take the Pony Express, for example, you had way stations, and at every way station you needed to be able to take care of the horses, take care of the people riding the horses, and pass the message along. Very expensive. But whereas a telegraph line, it just you may have to fix it periodically if a windstorm knocks out a wire. Lower costs, or lower maintenance costs over the long run. As for more secure, a horseman delivering a message, they may not make it. I mean, this is a dangerous route. If you're sending very important documents, it's going to take a while. But also, there's the risk that it may not make it. And then the last reason, more efficient. This is probably the innovation that our textbook focuses the most on. But the ability to communicate almost instantly with even the telegraph is a huge game changer. It's really hard to imagine what that means nowadays with the internet and high-speed internet. But in the olden days, with letters, there's no guarantee they'd make them, but with the telegraph, you could make a decision in 2 hours. You get the information from, say, New York to Los Angeles, make a decision, send a reply back, and now you can run very complicated businesses. But if you want a more particular example, think of it this way. If you've got a headquarters in New York, because that's where a lot of your money is coming from, you could have manufacturing done in, say, someplace like Chicago, and the New York branch could say, oh, we need to increase output, so they could send a telegram, and almost instantly, like that, switch over and increase production or adjust things accordingly. More coordination gives more potential for profit. It allows you to build factories where it's cheaper to build things as opposed to just having to keep everything near you. But no. Now, to talk about some of the more abstract ideas, we've got consumption and capitalism. These are the two big ideas that are going to come out of this time period. There's some kind of terms that I need to make sure that we're aware of. One of the things we see in this time period is capital, which is money or wealth used to invest in a business or an enterprise. And this is kind of one of the important things, is an individual can only make so much money through basically doing work by their own hands. But if they have a little bit of extra money, they could maybe invest it in something. Say somebody's trying to start up a business. They could pool resources together and make it more possible to run a more complicated, a bigger business, or just have the resources to even get started. Capital is not a new idea. The Industrial Revolution doesn't invent capital. It's an older idea. It's partially what got the American colonies settled by the English is through joint stock companies, if you remember, like the Virginia Company and whatnot. But essentially what happens with the Industrial Revolution is we crank it up to 11. Capital becomes even more important. And with the ability to coordinate over long distances, you can get investors from beyond the people you know around you. Capitalism, we're just going to use the very basic definition, is an economic and political system which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than the state. So these railroads that are being built up, that's built up by private individuals. These companies that are making all these goods, private individuals. But that's something to keep in mind. So when we're looking at tycoons, people who run big businesses, they're not affiliated with the government in a formal way. They're their own individual, and they own the companies themselves. The other important concept that's worth looking at here is consumerism, a theory that increasing consumption of goods is economically desirable. One of the things we'll see is capitalism and consumerism, even though they don't necessarily have to come together, they just always seem to. The two seem to go hand in hand a lot. But consumerism is essentially the idea of buying goods that are made. One of the things that comes up, it's a key term, but mass production makes more goods cheaper, because if you can make things in large quantities cheaply, you can sell them for cheaper, which means more people are able to buy them, which means you make more money. Industries, as they grew, the costs went down and the prices would go down, or at least in theory. You're going to see in practice that doesn't necessarily happen. But what happens is, as more people are able to make more money and buy things more cheaply, people are able to afford more things. Quick commercial break. Well, not a real commercial break, but here's some historical commercials from this time period. It used to be you'd have to make your own bed. In the Industrial Revolution, it was now easier to buy a bed. Now let's talk about the workforce. This particular unit is going to focus more on the workforce than other units. We will study unions and workers' rights in a future unit. But for now, we need to know who they are, what they're doing, kind of that mentality. The Industrial Revolution requires a massive workforce, as already stated. You need some people to organize production. Those would have been the middle class, the bourgeois. And you need others to do the production, make the stuff, the working class, the proletariat. As a result, all these groups are flooding into the cities for work. As you can see with this chart, while America may have been born on the farm, it grew up quite literally in the cities, in the industrialized cities. That actually leads us to one of our key terms, urbanization, the growth of cities. That's all it means. The reason why cities are growing during the Industrial Revolution is they're a good central location. They have infrastructure, so they may already have railroads. They've already got a lot of people to do the work, and as more people find out about work opportunities, more people keep pouring into those cities for work. There's kind of also an agricultural revolution, a mechanization of a lot of farming going on as well in this time period, which is quite arguably very important because that allows less people to be required to work on farms, which pushes them into the cities. But we'll talk about them in a second. As you can see, that almost 70-30 combination I told you, 70% on the farm life, 30% in the cities, it's going to practically flip-flop as the years go by, as America industrializes more and more. The cities that we see growing in this time period, we see a lot of them in the northeast. Northeast. The reason why we see that is this is where a lot of the cities already were, and the Industrial Revolution this is where the money was. This is where where a lot of people already were, and so that's why these cities start growing first. You'll also see that there's some cities growing up in here, Chicago particularly. It has water access. That's a big reason why. It will also become a major rail depot as well. Still, you don't see a lot of cities in large numbers developing throughout here. Really just in this area, you've got Atlanta. Birmingham will eventually come along. New Orleans is the only big one of significance popping up in here. And then California, there's a few settlements. But, yeah, that's kind of where the cities are coming in. Now, who's moving into these cities is probably one of the other important things we're going to look at in this unit. The first group is going to be the rural to urban migrants. They are exactly what you think they are. You should be able to suss out where they're coming from. There's essentially a lot more job opportunities in the city than there are out on the farm or in those quaint farming communities where they supply the farmers. A factory needs hundreds of workers. A general store might need one or two. And so, obviously, humans have a tendency to follow opportunities, and the opportunities were urban in this time period. The other big group that comes in here is immigrants. They are a big bunch. There are pull factors that bring them to the United States. Pull factors are things that draw people to a place. In many cases, it's the same for the rural to urban migrants. Industrial cities have a lot of jobs to be filled, tons of opportunities. And so that's one of the things that pulls people into American cities. These opportunities are not easy, as you'll find out, but America has them, and many people felt that America had more of them than other places. Also for immigrants, we have something called push factors. So if pull factors are what draw people towards a place, push factors are what push people away from a place. Many immigrants came to the United States, leaving their homelands to escape economic struggles, famine, persecution, wars. We'll go into more details about these in future classes, and we'll also look at where they're coming from, because we see a shift of different groups of Europeans coming into the United States as well as other groups coming in. But one of the things that's kind of interesting worth noting is that as places like the United States and Britain industrialize, more economic opportunities are popping up in these countries. Also, we can't forget America is considered the land of opportunity, and opportunity means employment in this time period for a lot of people. Additionally, there's other freedoms like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, safety away from Europe's wars in particular, or it's just a chance to get a new start. There's a lot of people who they've been caught up in generational jobs and families. And like you might be living somewhere in Europe and your family's done this one particular job for decades, for generations. The same thing your father did, the same thing your grandfather did. And for some, maybe they didn't want that, or maybe it wasn't an option anymore. If you were the second-born son, for example, or third-born, you might not be able to inherit the family business or inherit the family of decent position in the family business. And so America was seen as a place for a change of pace. Change was seen as an improvement for many immigrants. They came here to work very hard, and in some cases, this was the place they could turn to. But now I'm going to wrap up here to kind of keep my lectures a bit shorter, and also there's a lot going on in the Industrial Revolution. This is quite arguably one of the more complicated units we'll study. Now, my next segment, I'll talk more about urbanization, industrialization, the stuff that changed society and city life in America. And also we'll be looking at working conditions in this unit, because while there may have been opportunities in America, that doesn't mean they were easy, pleasant, fair, humane, or safe. But these are all matters for another lecture. So, until later.